The next panel, as I said right in the beginning of the day, I don't do MC duties just for the heck of it. I actually do work in Dasra on the urban sanitation team, so the next panel is a little special for me. Thank you, and I will be calling Anant from Dasra on stage, and there's a quick poll just to test if you do guess the right number on the largest behavioral change program in India, how many toilets were built?
This is, again, not too far away from lunch, so hopefully this will be an energizing session. I'm going to request my panelists to come on for a second. So I'm going to very quickly say thank you. Apoorva Oza, CEO, Aga Khan Rural Support Program. Thanks for joining us. Bijal Ben, Director, MHT. Thank you so much. And Dinesh Ji, Professor Emeritus at CEWA at CEPT University. Thank you, sir. As we start the discussion, I'd love you to demystify the topic of sanitation a little bit. Kal aaj. We'll come to the future, but I'd love us to go around the horn, and maybe if we can start with you, Apoorva, on the question of saying, as you saw the transformation over the last, let's say, 5 years, specifically on the areas of policy and the areas of how the government has been doing stuff, as well as some of the challenges. What would be some reflections from you?
You know, when you talk about Swachh Bharat Abhiyan and sanitation, there is, you know, in India, we love two sides to every discussion. So on one side, there's a lot which has happened, and then there'll be a lot of detractors who will say that it's not enough. And to some extent, like it is in India, most parts are true. But for me, I think these last 5 years have seen a huge, so we work in 3 states, in largely about 2,000 villages, and we've seen this change in places like Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat. You've seen a large number of toilets, not only constructed, because then people will say, but are they being used, but also being used. So there has been a change. So in a way, the cup is also half full. I'll tell you 3 parts which I've liked about the policy. You know, there are things which have been gaps, but what the state started off was with a very individual construct a toilet program. When it was first launched, the targets were construct 1,000 toilets, 2,000, you know, the numbers were all toilets. They quickly realized that transformative behavior is impossible to do in a village or any setting without a community context. So they quickly shifted from doing individual toilets to making villages open defecation free. Okay, so that was the second stage. And therefore the indices, the processes slightly changed. The third stage, they realized that because you were in a frantic hurry, actually you had some deadline, so then you moved to, in some ways it worked, to what we call blocks or districts being, you know, ODF. And therefore we participated to some extent in Gujarat, but largely in Bihar, where it was amazing. The whole district or this block machinery is just focused on this. And there was a lot of activists came out, self-help group women came out, panchayat leaders too, they had heroic stories. I think that's a part which went off well. And I think whatever we have here, that is the good part to show for it. 3 major gaps. We are doing things now which we could have done equally, which is the water part. So Marathwada, there's a drought, great toilets, no water, toilets abandoned. Many other parts, that's what happened. So the water piece was sort of missing. The second part was the disposal or that. So you had soak pits or you had your 2-pit system. But large villages and where aquifers were not conducive, or where in Bihar you have an aquifer which is very, very high, that's a problem. Because, and Bangladesh is a story. Bangladesh has done ODF before us, and now they are dealing with the problem of ODF because contamination in the high groundwater areas has started because they didn't take care of the ODF, you know, point discharge things. So that part we didn't do. We had pilots. So we ran a pilot. We've got some biogas run toilets which have been functioning for 10, 15 years. So these pilots were there, but because you wanted to do this, you know, the numbers and the targets, you didn't get enough time to work on the alternative ways to the simple standard 2-pit latrine design. So you couldn't explore that. and therefore in some areas you will be suffering the consequences. And the third thing I think is that we didn't miss the boat because this was itself, so this thing we missed the boat on sewage treatment or on, and on the urban part. I think the urban part has not been as good a story as the rural part is. You go to most slums, toilets are not there, they're not functioning. We work in Fulwari Sharif, which is a slum near Bihar, and you can barely find about a toilet per about 150, 200 households. So slums are still a problem. So I think these are the gaps. But on the balance, would the country have been better off with or without these 5 years? I think it's better off with these 5 years. Yeah.
Thank you. Let me speak louder. Yeah, thank you so much. And this, and I think the last statement you made, which is in many cases we find whenever there are positive news in the newspapers, our instinct is so wired to be cynical. We doubt everything. And while healthy cynicism is good, one of the things which you also pointed out is there is actually much to also feel good about while the journey is, really underway. And I'd like to get your thoughts, Bijal, Ben, on two things. One is, they say 60% to 70% of the world will live in urban centers by 2050. India is no exception. They also say that there is really growing demarcation between the haves and the have-nots, and especially in the urban center, inclusivity is reducing. So, in the work you have seen, and again, if you go back 5 years until now, what has worked and what has been a challenge? And do comment a little bit on the measurement mechanisms as well in your perspective.
Yeah, so Anant, we have been largely working in urban areas and across almost 8 states of India. And our model is to empower women and girls to raise their voice to primarily improve the landscaping of the slums, of which water and sanitation is a very big part. And I do agree with, Apoorva bhai when he said that, work is done. I do agree that urban has only recently become a focus. Now, let me just cite 1 or 2 instances on inclusivity and then move on to the measurement methodology, because I see that as becoming a very big deterrent, and we should be aware of that. It's not been much talked about in any of the water and sanitation sessions that I go. So when we were trying to, get our women and girls to use the Swachhta app, this was funded through a Dasra supported program, we suddenly realized that one, there were not many smartphones available to use the app. All those that were available were in the hands of the men in the poorer communities. And then you had to put in a lot of, effort to train the women and girls. And then you registered a complaint saying that, there is a heap of, say, waste lying here, or somewhere else the sewage is overflowing. And the computer reports the next day that the complaint has been addressed. And we have our women as watchdogs on the ground, and they still report that it's still there, it has been addressed in the computer. The next thing that we were doing in Rajasthan and in Maharashtra also, we saw, we were getting, it was a governance program where we were empowering these women and girls, APPI supported through Dasra, to go and talk to the government and make them accountable for the toilets, because they were missing. Till now they are missing. So we suddenly found that between the period of May and December, they will not lodge any complaint. Swachhta Sarvekshan aa raha hai, they will tell us. So we want our city to get the ODF or ODF plus or whatever. And there has been this huge race of cities. I even have stopped counting the numbers now, because every city that you see is at least getting declared ODF and then moving towards ODF plus plus. Now, I have nothing against the rating mechanism, because I think it was, introduced to have a, begin a progressive momentum, create a healthy competition between the cities, which it has. But the way it has been structured, we should probably look into it if that's going to become the norm. Because it's also, I am beginning to understand that as you are declared ODF, it will mean that the funding for the toilets will stop and move on to solid waste management and fecal sludge management, which is not to say that the need for solid waste and fecal sludge is not there. But that need of having toilets is also still very much there. So what happened was that you have these weekly, these inspections during December when the third-party team comes in. And so the entire municipality is standing in attention because there is a certain rating on direct observation. And the highest rating used to be on getting infrastructure services. And so they are all poor guys at 4 a.m. in the morning patrolling the streets, policing all the people, putting them in jail. In Amalner in Maharashtra, they were put in jail because they were defecating in the open, and many of them still didn't have access to toilets. So you go in the open, yeah? So that's what happened. So that's when we started investigating and looking into how this methodology was structured. I'm only just giving a few tips because time will be less. First of all, they had, it was like a, window dressing when the, the inspection came in. It was not a 365, 24/7 operation because that needed much, much more money and capacities. I'm not blaming the officials. Secondly, cities at very, very different scales were competing with each other. So you have Ahmedabad and Jaipur, which are like 45, 55, 100,000 population competing with Delhi and Bombay, which are the real metros. And we asked one official in Delhi, and he said, I am addressing East Delhi Municipal Corporation. The density is 44,000 people per square kilometer. And I am competing with New Delhi Municipal Corporation, where the density is 8,000 people per square kilometer. And how do I do it? It's completely different. So one was that. There was, of course, the window dressing was there. And I don't really want to keep on criticizing because it has set the ball rolling, and we have achieved a lot of momentum. But if these rating methodologies are going to become the norm of the day and every city is going to race to get itself declared, we will really have to look into the manner that we are, creating these rating methodologies and rating mechanisms.
Thank you. And just before calling on Dinesh to talk a little bit about, as you have seen the progression of different cities, not just in Gujarat, but also Maharashtra and others, what are some learnings around how the government approaches this, what works, and what potentially could work better? But so far we have heard a few points. I just want to summarize it. One is a holistic approach. Otherwise, India always has a problem of catch-up. So how does one approach a holistic approach? And second is, how does measurement inspire the right action rather than the wrong action? But Dinesh ji, would you talk a little bit about your experience across cities and with the government especially?
Well, you said that the panels after lunch are a bit of a challenge. So let me begin by challenging my panelists. I don't agree with either of them. One, if you start looking at, I think the Mentimeter as we were coming up, 6 million toilets. Actually, there are more if you go to the website. Part of the achievements of the Swachh Bharat, and unlike our friend here who heads the rural program, I only know urban. I teach urban planning, I work in the cities of India, so I cannot claim about what's happening in the villages. But in the cities of India, we are tracking through our pas.org.in, and you can go on your mobile phone and go to that website. For 900 cities of this country, we are tracking water, sanitation, and solid waste service delivery for the past, in Gujarat, Maharashtra for 10 years, for other 5 states for the last 5 years. Toilet access is 100% in Gujarat, 95% in Maharashtra. In Gujarat, and I'm sorry to say Apoorva, slums are as well endowed with water and sanitation as the non-slum population. Now, if you go down the smaller towns outside of the metro cities of Gujarat, the situation is poor in terms of the treatment facilities. We do not have enough treatment, and that is, I think, the theme of this session, that beyond toilet, what is really happening. And I think That's the real challenge. The whole Swachh Bharat mission was on making cities open defecation free. In some sense, and you may have anecdotes. I mean, you will see a picture of people on the Mumbai tracks and say, oh, Mumbai is not open defecation free. But 90% of the people defecating in the open in Mumbai are now not defecating in the open. So we have achieved a tremendous milestone that would not have been possible but for this program. Now on the measurement, I think we always have problems with any measurement yardstick. Best cities to live in. I mean, you ask the audience here, is Vienna the best city to live in, as the economist is saying? I mean, if I live in Vancouver, I'll say, no, Vancouver is the best city because from an urban planning, every measurement yardstick will have its own problem. This whole ODF plus and ODF plus plus are only a ways in which cities can progress from just building a toilet to move on to the next step of how do you treat the waste and the ODF plus plus. Our work in Maharashtra, we have actually been helping cities to become ODF plus plus. Just yesterday we received a message from one of the cities near Nashik called Sinnar, which became ODF plus plus, and I think it's one of the first cities in the state to be declared as ODF plus plus. Now it's not the show that Bijal is talking about. I think cities and officials in the cities are making genuine efforts. We can always find flaws sitting here, but I think we need to appreciate the efforts that are made by the government. And I think I heard in the morning also that we can do pilots very well with little projects here and there, but if you want to achieve scale, if you want to really reach out, and this country has achieved this SDG 6.2 goal of safe sanitation, and I think we'll be one of the first. We were the last when the MDGs were being measured, and I think under SDGs we will be well ahead. So, sorry my panelists, but I don't agree with you.
Thank you, Dinesh. And this was critical and required after a good lunch. So I hope this audience is waking up now. I wanted to make 2 points. And I think the behavior change and belief systems not only have to be driven through to the front line, I think the behavior change and belief systems also need to start changing amongst people in this room. Because this tendency to assume the government is hard to work with, nothing moves. Frankly, the reality is even in this sector, healthcare is a great example. And we can see smatterings of that starting in education as well. When that elephant dances, it really dances. On that, I'd love to, bring it to a slightly deeper conversation now on saying, okay, fine. A lot has happened, a lot has to happen. If going ahead, this audience in the room, and I'm specifically talking about, philanthropists or corporates, one of the challenges is, unlike education, unlike thinking of midday meals, unlike thinking of healthcare, this is a complicated field. And the field experts might be able to deconstruct a little bit, saying, how can you help? And the reason it's very critical is this sector needs help, but it is not as simple as helping out in other more linear sectors. So I'm going to start with Apoorva Bhai and really ask you the question. If you had to think of behavior change at the grassroots, what is the big top one challenge for the next 5 years? And how can this group help? And if you can give an example, if at all, of someone who is helping, that'll help. That'll be quite useful to this group.
We are all saying that the government did
a good job, so there's no doubt about it. But I think there is a Ashwathama, the Ashwathama problem? The Ashwathama problem is that, Ashwathama and then Soto voice, you say the elephant is dead. So in India, you go to a collector and you ask him, is it ODF? So he will say, yes, it is ODF. Then as per 2012, whatever census, it is done. So if the villages had more households, 180 households and 2012 census had 120, then 120 are done, it's ODF for him. So that is, I have no problems. I think 120 done is also, No, I'm telling you. So
No, it's
120,
true with the cities also.
120 is also better than 20. It's a great thing. We should be happy. But the danger of all, and one behavioral change which we'll have to do is that if as a country we have to solve problems, ambition is good, but being real and truthful about what's happening on the ground is very important. If we are all the time in the mode of proving, every person is proving, I have done ODF, this district has done ODF, the state is first in ODF, the city is first, then you are not improving. Because a lot of your energy and time is spent so much in proving that the improving doesn't get the energy and the humility. Proving acquires a competitive and sort of a gung-ho spirit, great stuff. Improving requires an acceptance of the ground reality and an humility to accept that we've not solved everything. Much more needs to be done. And I think that is the fundamental change as a policy maker and as people who work on the ground we require. Because otherwise I see this, I go to these workshops and seminars, even CS, everybody is, they've got these lovely PowerPoints and great numbers and, lots of flags. I work in so many, you can point those flags. The real, when you do on the ground, it's difficult. And therefore being humble about, the improving part, then we'll get better. So that's the overall thing. At a community level, I think we have worked out good methods, I speak for rural largely, of behavioral change at a community level. And some villages have done outstanding work. It's not state, communities have owned and they've done a lot of stuff. Where they are struggling is to first, as the population grows, as in the next 10 years, there'll be more households. How do you include these? And so that then the village continuously remains open defecation free. It's not a one-time thing, it's a continual thing. Okay, Gram Vikas has done some brilliant work on doing this sort of work, making it a continual part of a community effort. So that's one part. The second is, how do you deal with common waste issues? So toilet is a private waste issue. You have villages, you have urban areas, you have the commonality problem, the common waste. And how do you can do it privately, but there is a common waste issue. And those overall village sewage systems, how do you make them run? Solid waste collection. Plastic is now becoming such a huge problem in rural areas. We have cattle who are suffering because of huge plastic consumption. Because a lot of, these, what you call food stuff, the Lays, whatever, the snacks, they're all in plastic. Drinking water is now available in plastic pouches. So that plastic is messing up the whole village system. How do you create a community around dealing with that kind of waste in those areas? It's doable, but I'm saying now that behavioral methods which worked for getting the toilets done is not the same way. You need to approach it slightly differently. And I think that is the second round of challenge. The third, I think, is fundamentally, we will require a more entrepreneurial approach than just a subsidy-based approach. Because I genuinely believe that waste can be made wealth. I have, I don't know whether you know, near this Sabarmati ashram, there is this amazing young guy called Ashish Agarwal who runs this Paryavaran Mitra. I don't know whether you know of him. And they do, it is not a typical non-profit. They do brilliant stuff. And there are such examples in Pune, everywhere in cities, where young people are gathering waste pickers, doing cooperatives, but making it a viable activity. So it's not continuously dependent on, so you require a one-time subsidy or some subsidy for 2-3 years as a viability gap funding. But once that is done, then it can move on a sort of a sustainable path of its own. And I think this kind of hybrid funding is what is required. That, that is the change we'll require among the philanthropies and donors. It's not this one-time grant which is very transactional. You do a toilet is there, board is there, done. This will require funding entrepreneurs, institutions, co-ops around waste, which will then require initial grant money, then some access to debt money, so that they can scale up. So it's a different type of financing which will be required. So I think behavioral change will be required from the state, from the activists on the ground, and from the philanthropists and donors. I think these three all will need to sort of change the game, change the way they work, so that you can move to the next step. Yeah.
Thank you, Apoorva. And this do connect subsequently, because in that short narrative, I guess there were at least 4 or 5 areas where one can pitch in as philanthropists. Bijal Ben, if you look at just the gender inclusivity issue, what would be that one suggestion which goes beyond the ordinary, where philanthropists can plug in, help, or even catalyze change?
You're asking me for one suggestion, and that's going to be really, really difficult. But if I were to restrict myself to one suggestion, a lot of this ODF is also, you know, I think sanitation itself, and to make it more narrow, water and sanitation, access to water and sanitation has been a big, big gender issue. And therefore, we lost out on the focus on this issue in early years. And I think the one thing that we should try and do, and I know there are difficult areas, is this whole talk of getting ODF only through community toilets doesn't work. We can do one service at least, that giving universal coverage to all households, you know, with household level water and sanitation. We will be doing one very good, you know, addressing the biggest gender aspect. Because community toilets probably will not work in non-public areas. They'll work on railway stations and, you know, bus stands and other. And so many community toilets that I go to, at least in urban areas, in metros, are a big, big gender issue, because there is liquor, there is drugs, there is no electricity, there are rapes going on. And so I think universal coverage to the extent possible is probably going to deeply impact. And then there are, of course, other issues, but I think time is not permitting. So.
Yeah, but since I have all...
Just one second. The other elephant in the room sort of is this whole issue of manual scavenging, and how one particular community has, in our, you know, great country, been given this great role to play it primarily as their role. And that's the elephant in the room. We don't really talk about it up front, but as you go to urban sewage, treatment, all that stuff, that's an issue which we'll have to also address. That's a major behavioral change issue which we'll have to deal with because it's an issue. And you go to Delhi, you find this.
I'm going to change gears and end with you, Professor, on just the topic which happened in the morning also, on why solving wicked problems like this, and this is truly a wicked problem, it's interdimensional, it's not so linear, needs long-term funding and needs non-programmatic funding. And today, most of CSR funding, most of funding comes programmatic. Wicked problems cannot be solved by programmatic funding alone. So again, Dinesh ji, if you speak a little bit about your experience, positive and negative on that, that'll be great.
Yeah, but let me say, in the second round, I agree with you. on two aspects, the sustainability, you know, government or the community, everybody's done a great job in building toilets. Sustaining the ODF status in our own work has been a challenge. Managing the waste that the toilets generate is even a bigger challenge. And I agree with Bijal in the sense that as long as you move away from the community toilet syndrome, and in Gujarat, Maharashtra, you know, somehow there is the whole, I think in this audience I can use the term, there's a political economy around the community toilets. Each community toilet seat costs 20 lakhs. I could have built 25, 35 toilets into houses. But that, somehow I don't know why that number, and so so I think, I agree that we need to move toward. What is happening if you start looking at the funding, and the government goes into these cycles, you know, so we had this mission, and that is where we are concerned about the whole sustainability. Suddenly SBM is out of the radar.
Exactly.
We are now into Nal Se Jal and water. It's important, but this will be forgotten. So the funding that is coming, that is needed for the waste treatment is just not there.
So as soon as you get declared ODF or ODF
No, it's not so much of the declaring, but it's the whole programmatic approach that the government also has.
Which is
And
the
so
concern.
that is where we need to be looking at long-term sustenance, long-term, I wouldn't say funding, but long-term engagement. Our own work in Maharashtra, we have seen that we have engaged with a couple of cities for over 5-7 years. We understand the dynamics of how cities operate, no matter who changes, whatever. But we are continuously working, and we are managing to ensure that the sanitation systems improve. Funding is the biggest challenge, and this is, I think, something that this audience or this forum really needs to look at, that beyond government is not funding the waste treatment as much as it's focused on the metro cities. The big 500 cities of this country are getting probably some money. The 3,500 other cities are not getting the money. In Gujarat, other than the 7 municipal corporation, large number of cities, we do not really have even the proper treatment facilities and etc. Meera and I are trying to look at how do we go beyond government funding, how do we start looking at some of these innovative funding. We are trying to look at impact investing. The global world is talking about repayable capital, that we don't want charity, we want repayable capital. How do we bring this repayable capital or the impact funds into the fold of sanitation? We have ideas. If there are opportunities, we are happy to continue that further. But long-term engagement is certainly necessary. Sanitation is not a one overnight problem. We will have to engage in this in the long term.
Thank you. So just to leave the team and this audience, think of time where this group can fit in is the long term. Think of citizens, where this group can fit in is the vulnerable groups. And also then think of not just the construction, but the operation, maintenance, and the time that people forget this topic. This topic is not going to go away. So with that, I'd just love to thank the audience for an engaged discussion. But please reach out subsequently, reach out through the Dasra team. This field needs your support, for sure. Thank you.